From Sports Illustrated, our friend Ross Dellenger joins us right now on the Farm Bureau guest line. Check out favorites.com and go with the home team, Mississippi Farm Bureau. Hi, Ross.
Hey, Richard. How you doing?
Good, man. Great to catch up with you as always. Appreciate some of your time. We were talking this morning, kind of laying out what was going to go on the show, and I was like, we didn't get to the Jim Phillips Big Ten commissioner story. And hey, Dad goes, well, that's what Ross covers all the time. We should talk to him. And I was really fascinated by the timeline on this. There were a lot of people that thought Jim Phillips was the odds-on favorite to be the next commissioner of the Big Ten. The ACC made a move to extend his contract. I assume he got a raise. I don't know, but pushes it out basically to the end of the decade. And the Big Ten shortly thereafter announces its new commissioner. I'm curious why. One, and you can tell me I'm wrong on all of this, by the way, if that's the case. One, why Jim Phillips would have been the Big Ten's number one target beyond relationships, and two, why the ACC was so keen on keeping him.
Well, one, I don't know that he was their number one target. And in fact, over the last few weeks, while I was just digging into this, tracking this search, it became somewhat clear that Jim Phillips wasn't necessarily the top target. I think the ACC, as far as keeping him, is mostly happy with Jim. He kind of took over a situation of not his doing, obviously, with their television contract.
Right.
So I think that for the most part they're happy with him. I would assume that the contract extension was a combination of the Big Ten deal being open. It maybe there was some courting there, but again, I don't know that he was their number one target. I don't know that he was in a mix, a finalist. I don't believe he was. So I think it was a combination of that job being open, though, and in a combination of his contract, running low. I think he had maybe 2 years left on his deal or something. So, and again, they, from folks I talked to there, they seem to be pretty fine with Jim and Jim's leadership. Again, I think Jim took over a place where he's a little bit in a bind not of his making, and so it's a difficult position to be in for sure.
Hamstrung, I think is maybe the way to kind of describe it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that he's got teams that want more, and I don't know if there's a way for him to get more for them.
Well, they're trying, but there's really not. I don't know that there's of the solutions. I don't know that any will close the gap in any significant way between the ACC and the Big Ten and SEC, outside of ESPN fully renegotiating the deal and giving them more money, which is highly unlikely.
Yeah, at last check, Disney, who owns ESPN, has an initiative in place to cut $5 billion in expense. Doesn't seem like giving another $500 million or so to the ACC is going to be real high on their priority list.
No, and I think I don't know if it was Jimmy Pitaro or if it was over ESPN or if it was the Disney CEO came out and basically said they're going to have layoffs here soon and cutbacks, pretty significant maybe cutbacks here soon at ESPN. And then they've come out and talked about how they're going to be more selective with programming and bidding on programming. So it's pretty clear that you're probably not going to get a whole lot of extra money out of the ESPN, and then in addition to that, ESPN is probably going to give the SEC more money potentially for a ninth league game if it does happen. So yeah, there's I think the situation with the Pac-12 is a good indication that ESPN is not is not as freely doling out cash to conferences.
So you just put a qualifier on what you said if the ninth game happens. And I think everybody just assumes that the ninth game is going to happen and maybe assumes with good reason. But I also think you're wise to use that qualifier because that has not happened yet. It hasn't, at least as I understand it, they have not yet agreed to the 9-game schedule versus the 8-game schedule.
They have not. This has been a pretty dividing issue in the conference, and it's going on, probably a year and a half of debate back and forth and argument back and forth between administrators about this. And I think everything's been civil, of course, but I think that there's some strong opinions, and it's like a roll. This thing's been like a roller coaster ride because there has been a pretty wide assumption that everybody is moving in the direction of more league games and bigger games, more value. And so there was kind of an assumption that, first of all, number one, the SEC would do this because there's that movement. Number two, the bigger programs, the top 4, 6, maybe top 8 of the league want to do this, and they often get their way. But it hasn't happened yet, so there obviously is still some disagreement enough to stall this thing. And I think you'll probably see it solved at SEC spring meetings or maybe even just before. And a lot of it, as I've written, is going to be contingent on ESPN's additional revenue that it gives the league for a potential ninth game.
And I mean, if we're using our brains, revenue is what's going to win out in the end, right? I mean, making this a semi-local example, additional revenue is probably a bigger deal for Ole Miss and Mississippi State than it is for Alabama and Georgia. And Alabama and Georgia are already kind of on board with this.
Well, on board with
a 9-game schedule. No,
well, not the school in Tuscaloosa. No, they made that quite clear. Nick Saban made that quite clear to me about a month ago or so in his comments about how he believes he disagrees with Alabama's 3 permanent opponents in a 9-game model, and he believes there's more equity and parity around the league with an 8-game model. So it surprised some folks, but
that's kind of an about-face for him, isn't it? Though
it is. He has talked quite a long, and we talked about that when I sat down with him. Is that he's been preaching for more league games for a while, more bigger games. But I think part of it is he disagrees with the SEC's permanent opponents that they've suggested to him for his school, and I think they're in the 8 camp. And if they're in the 8 camp, and there's probably some lower level teams, 1 or 2 schools I've heard that are actually in the 9 camp. But if Alabama's in the 8 camp, then it's a fairly split bunch, which it has been now for over a year. And there's benefits and drawbacks to both 8 and 9 games, but the SEC office probably knows that it's going to get criticized pretty heavily if they don't go to 9 games, and they don't take advantage of their powerhouses and their power schools. And because one of the things that I think many of the programs in that conference will use is, we want to play a 4th non-conference game to get that extra win. And it's just a kind of a weak look. And so they're going to certainly get criticized if they end up going with 8.
Ross, we've only got a minute left. Our time is always too short. Tell me what we need to know about Tony Petitti. There was a line in your story that said, one college sports insider describes Petitti as safe and solid who only needs to keep the Big Ten train running on time. That feels a little simplistic.
Yeah, it is. Obviously, he's kind of set up in a lot of ways with the job, with the media rights deal done, expansion. But there are certainly a host of issues he faces. I mean, from the athlete compensation and the future of the NCAA to scheduling and onboarding USC and UCLA, they don't have scheduling formats. Speaking of the SEC's scheduling format, the Big Ten doesn't have it. So there are plenty of issues. Bringing back together kind of that AD room was a little splintered under Kevin Warren. They didn't go as smoothly with him as commissioner. So there'll be certainly some challenges ahead. But he's an interesting guy. He's a former TV executive, has made and been overseen a lot of big decisions and a lot of people.
Ross, thanks as always for your time. Next time you talk to Nick Saban, tell him we all hope that he can catch a break in the future. And we're sorry it's been so tough on him.
Yes, indeed.